My name is Ethan Miller, a 24-year-old trying to piece my life back together after dropping out of college. When Mr. Collins offered me a job watching over his cornfield at night, it seemed like the quiet break I needed. The pay was decent, and the isolation sounded like a relief from the constant noise in my head. On the third night of my new job, an unsettling feeling crept over me as I walked the rows of corn. The wind had died completely, leaving an oppressive silence that weighed on me. My footsteps crunched against the dried husks, but beneath that, I heard something else. A soft sound, almost like a sigh, trailing behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw only shifting shadows cast by my flashlight. A week into the job, the whispers began to form words. Standing alone in the middle of the field, I heard a thin, distant voice call my name. Ethan! I whipped my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something pale slipping between the stalks. A face without expression. No body attached. It watched me for a split second before vanishing. My hands trembled, and I questioned my sanity. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but that night I found heavy footprints leading from the trailer into the corn. They were larger than mine and stopped abruptly deep within the field, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. The realization that I wasn't alone out there tightened a knot of dread in my stomach. Mr. Collins must have sensed something was off because he hired another guy, Connor Thompson, to share my shift. Connor was my age, another college dropout looking for easy cash. He was cocky and full of energy, dismissing my concerns with a laugh. Probably just some kids messing around, he said. As we patrolled together, the whispers grew louder, following us like a persistent echo. Connor joked about them at first, but I could see the unease in his eyes. On the 12th night, Connor didn't show up. No call, no text. His truck was still parked outside, and his belongings were untouched in the trailer. Not the first time someone walked off the job, Mr. Collins said, but his casual tone didn't match the worry lines on his face. The cornfield had swallowed Connor whole, and no one seemed to care. Alone again, the faces in the corn multiplied. Everywhere I turned, pale visages flickered between the stalks, their hollow eyes tracking my every move. When I shone my flashlight on them, they vanished. But in the dim glow, their hungry expressions were unmistakable. I felt hunted. That night, I saw someone different, a man wearing an old worn-out hat standing motionless in the distance. I shouted at him, but he didn't respond. The whispers intensified, wrapping around me like a cold fog. The man tipped his hat and stepped backward into the corn, disappearing like smoke. The air turned frigid where he'd stood. Frustrated and terrified, I confronted Mr. Collins. "You never mentioned this place had a history," I said. He avoided my gaze, his fingers fumbling with a worn handkerchief. "People don't like to talk about it," he muttered. "Not everyone sees them, but those who do, they don't stick around long." That night she appeared again. The girl. She stood at the edge of the field, her eyes too large for her pale face. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. "Help me," she whispered. My legs felt like lead as she took a step toward me. In a blink, she was gone, leaving me gasping for breath. I stumbled back to the trailer, my heart pounding like a drum. The following day, Mr. Collins was furious. Several of his cows had vanished overnight without a trace. No blood, no tracks, nothing. "It's the field," he whispered under his breath, eyes darting toward the corn. "It's taking them." By the 15th night, the faces were no longer silent. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words I couldn't understand. It felt like they were beckoning me, luring me deeper into the corn. I fought the urge to follow, but their voices clung to me, even after I left the field. That night I dreamt of my mother. She'd passed away when I was 16, but in the dream, she sat on the edge of my bed like she used to when I was a kid. "Ethan, it's not safe," she said softly, her hand brushing the hair from my forehead. I jolted awake, her voice echoing in my ears. Looking out the trailer window, I could have sworn I saw her ghostly figure walking toward the cornfield. Desperate for answers, I rifled through old files in Mr. Collins's office and found a worn map of the property. Parts of it were torn away, but faint marks indicated unmarked graves, all within the cornfield. A chill ran down my spine. That night, a new figure appeared, a man in his 30s wearing a faded uniform identical to mine. He wandered aimlessly between the stalks, head down as if searching for something. "Hey!" I called out. He didn't react, disappearing deeper into the corn until he was gone. As I stood there, shaken, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, but nothing was there. The feeling of unseen eyes watching me intensified. The corn whispered, the rustling leaves forming words I couldn't quite grasp. Strange symbols began to appear on the cornstalks, twisted markings etched into the leaves and stems. They looked freshly carved, deliberate. I had no idea what they meant, but a deep sense of foreboding told me they weren't good. Navigating the rows became increasingly difficult. The stalks seemed to close in on me, the space narrowing as if the field itself was alive. Each step felt heavier, my legs trudging through an invisible mire. Panic bubbled within me. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Connor. Relief washed over me until I noticed his vacant eyes and the same unnatural smile the girl had worn. "Connor," I whispered. He didn't respond. When I reached out to touch him, his form dissipated like smoke, leaving nothing but cold air. I stumbled back to the trailer, my mind racing. The phone rang. It was Mr. Collins. "You need to leave, Ethan," he said, his voice trembling. "They're getting stronger. Those who disappear don't die. They become part of the field." On the 20th night, I decided it was time to confront whatever was haunting this place. Armed with a flashlight and sheer desperation, I ventured into the cornfield. The faces emerged en masse, surrounding me. Their whispers coalesced into a deafening roar. I ran, pushing through the tight rows, but no matter how fast I moved, they stayed with me. Breaking through the last row, I expected to find the open field leading back to the trailer. Instead, I was back where I started, in the heart of the cornfield, encircled by those hollow eyes. My chest tightened as I realized there was no escape. The field had claimed me just as it had claimed the others. As the faces closed in, their whispers enveloping me, I understood the truth. We were all bound here. Connor, the girl, the man in the hat. All lost souls tethered to the restless spirits of this cursed land. And now, I was one of them. Story 2. My name is Lucas Thompson, and I never imagined that taking a job on a quiet Midwest farm would plunge me into a nightmare I can't escape. I arrived at Hank Miller's farm a few weeks ago, thinking it would be a peaceful place to clear my head after leaving the city. Hank, a gruff man in his 50s with weathered skin and piercing eyes, seemed grateful for the extra help. He didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer much about my past. At first, the days were long but satisfying, but as the nights stretched on, they began to blur together. I started to notice the silence, or rather, the lack of it. Faint whispers carried on the wind would reach my ears, so subtle I thought I was imagining them. One night, I froze, straining to hear. My flashlight swept across the endless rows of corn, revealing nothing but swaying stalks. I told myself it was just the wind, but a knot of unease settled in my stomach. A week later, I saw it, a shadow slipping between the corn stalks. My pulse quickened. Gripping my flashlight, I rushed forward, but the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Someone or something was out there, watching, The next day I wandered into the local diner, hoping a hot meal might calm my nerves. That's where I met Claire Miller, Hank's daughter. In her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and tired eyes that held untold stories, she offered me a cup of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said softly. "Just restless nights," I replied, attempting a smile. She hesitated before adding, "I grew up here. If you hear anything strange at night, don't follow it, just let it be." Her words caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" But she just shook her head, avoiding my gaze. "Trust me." That night, sleep eluded me again. Driven by a mix of curiosity and dread, I ventured deeper into the cornfield. My foot caught on something and I stumbled into a clearing. There, etched into the dirt, were strange symbols surrounded by corn husks arranged in a perfect circle. A chill ran down my spine. This was no prank. I rushed back and found Hank in the barn. "I found something out in the field," I began, describing the unsettling scene. He shrugged it off. "Probably just some kids messing around. Nothing to worry about."
But his dismissive tone didn't match the flicker of unease in his eyes.
Determined to find answers, I searched the old storage room the next day. Behind a pile of dusty equipment, I discovered a worn journal belonging to someone named Roy Parker, a farmhand who worked here decades ago. His early entries were mundane, but they soon descended into frantic scribbles about voices in the corn and beings that watched him from the shadows. "I see them watching me. They know I'm here," one entry read. The last dated entry was from 1998. "I can't escape them." Roy was never mentioned by Hank or anyone in town. I confronted Hank with the journal. "Why didn't you tell me about Roy?" He stiffened. "You shouldn't have found that. Roy was unstable. This place can get to people." "Get to people? What does that mean?" He avoided my gaze. "Just focus on your work, Lucas." That night the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. As I peered into the darkness, a figure emerged, a tall, hunched silhouette standing motionless among the corn. My breath caught. I stepped forward, and in an instant it vanished like smoke. I sought out Claire the next day. She looked over her shoulder before pulling me aside. "There's a history here," she whispered. "People have gone missing. It all centers around this farm." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" She gripped my arm. "Because talking about it makes you a target. You need to leave." "Not until I know what's going on." That night, sleeplessness and fear drove me back into the fields. Hidden among the rows, I saw them. Hooded figures gathered in a circle, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. My skin crawled. One figure turned abruptly, and though I couldn't see a face beneath the hood, I felt eyes locking onto mine. Panic surged, and I ran. The following morning I discovered a dead goat in the field, its throat slit, blood staining the ground where the hooded figures had stood. Horror twisted my stomach. This was a warning, or a prelude. Suspecting Hank's involvement, I decided to follow him after sunset. Keeping a safe distance, I watched as he joined the hooded figures in the cornfield. My heart sank. Hank wasn't just aware of what was happening, he was part of it. Claire found me later, her face pale. "They're after you," she said urgently. "You saw too much. You're not safe here." "Come with me," I pleaded. "We can leave together." She shook her head. "It's not that simple." That night, as I hurried through the cornfield, footsteps pounded behind me, heavy and relentless. I ran harder, lungs burning, but the footsteps matched my pace. Bursting out of the corn, I looked back. Nothing, just the rustling stalks. The next day, Claire was gone. She didn't show up at the diner and her house was empty. Desperation gnawed at me. I went to the sheriff, but he dismissed my concerns with a tight smile. "You're letting local legends get to you," he said. Frustrated and alone, I knew I had to act. As darkness fell, I armed myself with a flashlight and a sense of determination. Venturing into the cornfield, I stumbled upon a horrifying scene. The hooded figures stood in a circle, silent and waiting. In the center was Claire, bound and terrified, and without thinking, I charged forward. "Let her go!" I shouted. The figures turned toward me, but before they could react, I broke through the circle and untied Claire. Hank stepped forward, lowering his hood. "You don't understand, Lucas," he said calmly. "The farm demands a sacrifice. It's the only way." "You're insane," I spat. He smiled sadly. "It's already too late." Grabbing Claire's hand, we ran. The hooded figures pursued us, their chants morphing into enraged shouts. The cornfield became a maze, each row indistinguishable from the last. Claire stumbled, and I pulled her up, adrenaline fueling our escape. We reached my truck and sped away from the farm. The town's lights faded in the rearview mirror, but a lingering dread remained. We drove for hours until exhaustion forced us to stop at a motel off the highway. For a moment, I thought we might be safe. But that night, the whispers returned, seeping through the walls and into my dreams. The next morning, Claire found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of the truck. Her hands trembled as she handed it to me. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, it read, "You can't escape. The farm never lets you go. Roy." A cold realization settled over me. The evil tied to that farm wasn't confined to its fields. It had marked us, and no matter how far we ran, it would follow. "What's happening to us?" Claire whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, fear tightening my chest. "But we can't let it consume us." We decided to head west, hoping distance would weaken whatever held us captive. Days turned into weeks, but the whispers persisted, always at the edge of hearing. Sleep became a luxury neither of us could afford. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we pulled into a small town. Desperate for rest, we checked into another motel. That night, I dreamt of the cornfield, the hooded figures, and Hank's cold eyes. I awoke to Claire's screams. Rushing to her side, I found her clutching her head. "They're here," she cried. "They're inside my mind." I didn't know how to help her or myself. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. Every shadow hid a threat. Every whisper carried a sinister message. In a final attempt to break free, we sought out anyone who might understand. Paranormal experts, priests, anyone. Most dismissed us as delusional. Others listened with pity, but offered no solutions. One day, a package arrived at our motel room. Inside was Hank's journal, filled with entries dating back decades. It detailed rituals, sacrifices, and the dark entity that the farm served. The last entry was recent. "The farm has chosen new ones. They cannot escape." Despair consumed me. Claire sat beside me, her eyes hollow. "What do we do now?" she asked. I took her hand. "We keep moving. We don't give up." But deep down, I knew the truth. The farm had sunk its claws into us, and no matter how far we fled, we carried its curse within us. As we drove into the fading daylight, the whispers became a constant companion, a haunting reminder that some evils are inescapable. I don't know how our story will end, but as the nights grow longer and the whispers louder, one thing is certain: the farm will never let us go.